Good evening, everyone. My name is Grace Hayek, and I'm talking to you from the Glencoe Public Library. I'm here with my colleague and friend, Beth Keller from Highland Park Library, a few miles north, and with Andrew Santella, tonight's speaker. So thank you all for being here. I wanted to mention that this is a webinar, a Zoom webinar, so we cannot see you or hear you. But you are welcome to put your questions and comments into the chat or into the Q&A. And after he finishes his presentation, our speaker would be happy to answer the questions, and I will give the questions to him on your behalf. So this will be recorded. It'll be up on our YouTube channel within a few days, probably by next Tuesday or so. So if you see it and you want to share it with somebody, you're welcome to go to the library's website and send it out. If you have any trouble finding it, just email me and let me know and I'll send it to you. We're also going to do a little poll just to see who is watching tonight and where they're watching and where they're from. So if you would please do that, I would really appreciate it. Oh, how interesting. Most of you are not from Glencoe or Highland Park. That's different. Okay, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. All right, 74 and 23. All right, great. That was fun. Now, my friend Beth will introduce our speaker tonight, Andrew Santella. Take it away, Beth.
Okay, thanks, Grace, and welcome, Andrew. Andrew Santella is the author of Soon, An Overdue History of Procrastination, From Leonardo and Darwin to You and Me, which he's speaking about tonight. He's also a journalist and a keynote speaker. Andrew speaks frequently on topics such as creativity, productivity, dealing with deadlines, and history's great procrastinators. His work has appeared in magazines, including GQ, The Atlantic, Slate, and the New York Times Book Review. His essays have been honored by the editors of the Best American Essays series and by the Council for the Advancement and Support of Education. Andrew grew up on the northwest side of Chicago, and he now lives in Brooklyn, where he's joining us tonight. Thanks to the Bookstall in Winnetka for partnering with us tonight. A link to purchase the paperback edition of Soon, An Overdue History of Procrastination, From Leonardo and Darwin to You and Me can be found in the chat box tonight. And now I'll turn it over to Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you, Grace. And thank you to everyone from the Glencoe and Highland Park Libraries. It's a good time to point out that public libraries, free public libraries, like really essential part of our lives. I think we've discovered that, rediscovered that in the last year or so, and it's more important than ever to support them. So let's hear it for libraries. I know and thank you to the Bookstall too. Let's hear it for independent bookstores too. I know I'm looking forward to the day when we can start doing these events in person again. I think this is right around my 1-year anniversary on Zoom, which doesn't really seem like the kind of milestone you want to celebrate, but tonight we're going to be talking about procrastination and productivity, and we're going to be talking about getting things done and not getting things done. And I think about this time last year, the awful spring of 2020. One of the more ridiculous things I remember about that time was being told repeatedly that Shakespeare had written King Lear while he was in quarantine during an outbreak of the plague, and the idea was that apparently being under quarantine would be a great time for us to get all the things done that we've been meaning to get done for a long time now, which is an odd idea, but I remember encountering that factoid everywhere, and I think it started with a tweet from the country singer Rosanne Cash, of all people, and went viral from there. And I suppose it was supposed to be an encouraging idea, kind of empowering, but like, imagine what you could do with all your free time now. But it's definitely an odd way to think about a global calamity. as if that could be the sort of thing to recharge your creativity. But I know for me, and I think probably for a lot of us, it didn't quite work out that way. I did not write my King Lear, nor did I get good at gardening or baking, though I did get to see more pictures of my friends' sourdough starters than I ever would have thought possible on Instagram. I'm one of those people who have experienced the pandemic mostly as a disruption of routine. And I feel fortunate that the consequences for me and for the people I love haven't been any worse than that. But the disruption and the stress have been very real. The offices we worked at closed. The schools our children attended closed. The bagel store at the corner closed. A lot of us started working from home, or at least trying to work from home. And that's not always easy in this new world where your office mates might include a rampaging toddler or a surly teenager. And we started referring to all this as the new normal. But for me, it was a very old normal. I've worked at home for years, and I know from experience that the home office can be an incubator for procrastination. Working from home offers abundant opportunities to do anything except the thing you're supposed to be doing. I found that when faced with an urgent work deadline, often the first thing I do is something like clean the grout in the bathtub, or maybe re-alphabetize my LP collection, or watch YouTube videos of somebody else's dog barking at a spoon. Anything to avoid doing the work I'm supposed to be doing. So I suppose this is a good time for us to talk about what exactly constitutes procrastination, defining our terms. What are we talking about when we talk about procrastination? Experts define procrastination as intentional delay with the knowledge that the delay will have negative consequences for us in the future. I spoke with a lot of experts on procrastination when I was working on my book, Soon, a few years ago. Oh, hold on. Shameless plug, Soon. Get it at the independent bookseller near you. So I talked to psychologists, behavioral economists, neuroscientists, life coaches have been positing their strategies for how to defeat procrastination. Self-help experts have their ideas. One of the paradoxes of procrastination is that it has become sort of a mini industry that keeps so many people so very busy. And I don't know exactly when I first had the idea to try to write a book about procrastination, but I do know that for a long time I didn't do anything about it. For me, the topic evokes these really powerful memories of the Sunday night dread of my childhood that followed a weekend of not doing my homework. Like, why did I wait so long? And one of the things I learned is that, I'm not alone in that feeling. Procrastination is as old as work itself. As long as there have been jobs to do, there have been people finding reasons to put off doing them. The ancient Greek poets warned against procrastination. Cicero, the ancient Roman orator and statesman, called it hateful. The New Testament is filled with admonitions to hurry up and take care of the important stuff, like repentance. But even the saints don't always succeed. St. Augustine of Hippo famously prayed for chastity, but he was careful to add, not yet. So what's our problem? Thinkers going back millennia to Aristotle have wondered why individuals fail to do what they know is good for them. Why don't we just get on with the job, get it done? Well, one answer is it depends on who you ask. All those different disciplines I was talking about a minute ago have each their own idea about what procrastination is about. It may be an expression of our genes, or it may be a moral failing, or it may be correlated to depression, or it may be a cognitive lapse. Or, as some people want to argue, maybe procrastination is a product of the times we live in. Maybe, and you hear this claim a lot in regard to the distractions of the internet and the iPhone, because each generation thinks that theirs is the most messed up, the most guilty of procrastination. More than 100 years ago, at the turn of the 20th century, the worry was that procrastination was being fueled by the accelerating pace of life brought on by new technologies like the telephone and the automobile. So now that we find ourselves in another time of disruption and distraction, I think it's useful for us to dive deep into the history of procrastination. For the last year or so, many of us have been living without the structures, without the routines that used to govern our work lives and that used to help us navigate them. And it remains an open question whether we'll ever return to the old ways of work. But I think we can learn a lot about the way we work today, or maybe the way we don't work today, about considering people of the past and their tendency to procrastinate. And tonight we're going to consider one case in particular. That's Charles Darwin, the 19th century British naturalist who taught the world how natural selection works. Again, so in honor of Darwin, I'm going to be showing you some visual aid, but I'm not going to be sharing them on my screen. I'm going to be doing it the 19th century way. I'm going to be holding them up in front of the camera. So this is Charles Darwin. I like this picture of Darwin because it's the young Darwin. I think most of us have seen pictures of the white beard, old Darwin. But this is him right around the time he got married. And that's young Darwin. Here's Emma Wedgwood, who became Mrs. Darwin. They were a great couple. Anyway, Darwin, one of the most prolific and consequential writers and thinkers of his time, but he also engaged in a chronic, decades-long delay that nearly prevented him from completing the great work for which he's now known. Darwin's delay nearly cost him his place in history. And I want to pause now to dispel a really common myth about procrastination, a misconception. And that's the idea that procrastinators are lazy. Procrastination, in fact, has little to do with laziness. Procrastinators are some of the busiest people you know. It's just that they're busy doing things other than the things they're supposed to be doing. This is what the humorist Robert Benchley was getting at in his classic essay called "How to Get Things Done." He wrote, "Anyone can do any amount of work, provided it isn't the work he's supposed to be doing at that moment." And that's Darwin in some sense, because as great and as prolific as he was always making intellectual detours and sometimes making actual physical detours. Darwin, like a lot of us in these last 12 months or so, 13 months, lived the work from home life. He lived in a country house outside London in Kent called Down House. More visual aids here. This is a picture of Down House. Nice suburban home. I'm not sure they would have called it suburban in those days. I think they would have called it the country. And you see in the foreground part of Darwin's garden. When I was there, I saw that they had recreated some of Darwin's experiments in the garden there, where they had sections of the garden roped off and sectioned where he had been investigating soil and the effect of earthworms on soil. He had a lot of interests, a lot of really eclectic interests, as we'll see. But at his home in Kent, at Down House, he would spend most of the day by himself in his study working. But he also loved to get out in the garden to experiment, but also just to walk. Whenever he needed to think, he liked to walk. And he laid out a sand and gravel path there in his garden, 1/5 of a mile around the garden, and beautiful place lined with holly and hazel bushes. And he walked it every day, usually with his fox terriers. And like I say, it's where he went to go to do his heavy thinking. But you have to wonder how much thinking he got done there. What with the dogs underfoot and the kids running around. Darwin's kids were really active and they loved to play pranks on him. Darwin had a habit of, when he walked around the garden, he would set stones down at the end of each lap so that he would know how much he walked. Kind of like the 19th century version of Fitbit. But what Darwin's kids would do is, when he wasn't looking, they would steal the stones. And so he would never know exactly how far he'd gone, and he would spend a lot of extra time circling his garden because of his kids. You have to wonder how he ever got anything done at all. And I think maybe some of us can understand, sympathize, empathize, and appreciate his situation. He was also like us in feeling plagued by the information technology of his day. He depended on the penny post, which had just started in England. He depended on it to keep himself in touch with the scientific establishment in London. In fact, the only reason it was possible for him as a young up-and-coming scientist, only reason it was possible for him to live where he did was because of the penny post and because of the new railroads that allowed him to easily communicate with London much more quickly than he could in the past. So the penny post was, for Darwin and for everyone, was a blessing, but it was also, and again, we can understand this as texters and emailers, it was also a curse, because it brought a ton of correspondence for Darwin to have to respond to and read. And on those rare days when he didn't get any mail, he was always really grateful, and he would be careful. He would take care to note in his diary, as if it was cause to celebrate. No mail to have to answer today. Darwin was a person who always worked at his own pace. When he was a young man, his father really continually pressed him to choose a career. The ministry was under consideration. Medical school was another option. But Darwin didn't choose any of those. He chose none of the above. Instead, he asked for a deferral. He said he needed a little more time to think about it. And he went on in his early 20s, living sort of a life of aimless devotion to the sporting interests of the English gentry, like shooting and riding. And I quote here, singing jolly songs. That was apparently one of Darwin's hobbies. And it wasn't until he was invited to travel aboard the HMS Beagle. We've all heard about that famous voyage on the HMS Beagle, circumnavigated the globe. It wasn't until he was invited to come on board the Beagle, as his title was scientific person. It wasn't until that voyage that he found work that really mattered to him. He spent 5 years aboard the Beagle, and that trip, because of the letters and the journals that he sent back ahead of him to England, that trip made him a minor celebrity in scientific circles in England. And he arrived back home in 1837 to a book contract and to way more dinner invitations than he could possibly accept. And Darwin, amid all this busyness, spent a lot of his first year or two home after his voyage on the HMS Beagle, scribbling in these private notebooks he kept, little pocket notebooks, about like so, except his were fancier, his were leather bound. And he would write in these notebooks and sort of work out the problems that he was trying to solve, and sort of commit to paper some rough drafts of his ideas. And one of the things he was trying to work out in his journals was the answers to some questions that he encountered on his trip around the world. In places like the Galapagos Islands, he noticed all these tiny variations in species from place to place, and he wanted to try to account for that. And by 1838, a year after he returned, he had set down in his notebooks the fundamental idea at the heart of what we now call the theory of natural selection. Each species changes, each species changes. That's what he wrote in his notebook. And that's just 3 words, but it's hard to imagine 3 more momentous words in, natural science. Darwin said that species are not fixed features of some divine plan. Rather, the organism's environment favors certain random mutations, and species evolve gradually over time as a result. And Darwin called this gradual process natural selection. Now, Darwin knew, he must have known, that this was world-changing stuff, belief-shattering stuff. He knew what an important advance he had made. And you might have expected him to rush to flesh his ideas out, claim credit for them, try to publish them. But he didn't do any of that. Instead, he did something odd. After having made one of the great intellectual leaps in history, he dropped the matter. He locked his notebooks up, told almost no one about their existence, and made no effort to publish, at least not right away. Instead, Darwin put his big idea aside and went to work on matters that to us might seem almost comically small. What did he do? Well, he married, for one thing. We met Emma a minute ago. He married and he moved to Down House. We saw some pictures of Down House. And he wrote articles for a gardening magazine called The Gardener's Chronicle. One of his articles was about the advantages of using wire rope for well buckets. Pretty consequential stuff. He spent 8 years also during this time working on barnacles, researching barnacles. So here's Darwin at his home, peering into microscopes, surrounded by jars and jars of barnacles, pickled in alcohol, filled the house. And Darwin was trying to master the incredible variety and diversity of barnacledom. He called them my beloved barnacles. And one of his friends said that Darwin had barnacles on the brain, and I think he was right. Darwin's children, grew up believing that all parents had obsessions like their fathers. The story is that one of Darwin's young kids went to visit a friend at the friend's house and looked around the house and asked, "Where does your father do his barnacles?" Not sure if that's an actual true story or just apocryphal, but it's too good not to repeat, I think. And Darwin had, as if the barnacles weren't enough, he had another obsession, and that obsession was with earthworms. Darwin got really interested in earthworms, spent literally decades watching the way they worked in his backyard, took measurements of how much earth they displaced, how they studied how they improved the soil. Those were some of the researches that I was talking about that have been recreated in the garden at Down House today. Another thing with the worms, Darwin liked to bring jars of the creatures into the house. No word on how Emma felt about that, but he'd bring the jars into the house and he would set them on the piano, and he would ask his kids to play on the piano because he wanted to see how the worms would react to the music. Not surprisingly, this obsession with worms attracted some attention. Here's a picture of, this is a caricature of Darwin. It might be a little hard to make out. This is from Punch, the satirical magazine from England. And I don't know if you can make that out. That's a really impressive sized worm that Darwin seems to be pondering. Yeah, so this was sort of the public image persona of this eccentric scientist thinker of that time, and some of the things that he was obsessed with. Okay, but what about the big stuff, the important stuff, Darwin's masterwork? What happened to the book in which he was going to outline the workings of natural selection? Did he just forget about it, abandon it? Well, no, but he did take nearly 2 decades to get to serious work on it. And it wasn't until nearly 20 years later that he would get down to explaining the concepts that he first outlined in those private pocket-sized notebooks in 1838. Now, historians and Darwin biographers have a name for this period when he spent some time making music for worms. They call it the long delay sometimes, the long wait. And I'm really interested in the choice that Darwin made in those years, the choice to work on small things and a lot of different small things rather than the one big thing, the one big idea. So why did he delay? Or was he delaying at all? Was he instead, maybe he was just being a diligent and painstaking scientist who's making sure that he really thought through what he was going to present to the world. And if he did delay, why? Was it because he feared how the world would react to his, without question, what would without question be really controversial ideas at that time? Or did he lack confidence in his own theory, in his own thinking? What makes any person, let alone Darwin, what makes any person put off something when they know that the delay might prove costly to them? Well, that's not an easy question to answer, partly because there are as many reasons to procrastinate as there are procrastinators. Psychologists think about procrastination in their own unique way. They think of it as a failure to manage moods or emotions. And that's in contrast to sort of the popular idea that procrastination is about time management. Psychologists say no. Most researchers on procrastination say no. It's not about time management. It's a problem of mood management, emotion management. We procrastinate, they would say, because we're trying to, in some way, respond to our anxieties or fears and to avoid some outcome that we dread. Procrastination, in fact, may be a form of what is sometimes called self-handicapping. You could think of self-handicapping as a strategy of intentionally sabotaging your own efforts. Why would anyone be so self-defeating? Well, one reason is to protect yourself from the shame of failure. An example, I have a test on Friday, but I don't start studying for that test until late on Thursday. Postponing my work gives me an excuse. I can tell myself that when I fail the exam, if I fail the exam, it would be because I didn't try, I didn't study, I didn't make my best effort. Rather than a self-handicapper would rather the rest of the world think that he lacked effort than that he lacked ability or competence. So we handicap ourselves to protect ourselves and from some truth and to project some image to the rest of the world. The problem, of course, is that our delay only makes our task harder and increases the likelihood of failing. which is the outcome that we're trying to avoid in the first place, or the outcome that we're trying to cover up in the first place. And the funny thing is that procrastinators may be more likely to handicap themselves when the stakes are highest. So in one study, psychologists found that students were more likely to put off preparing for a test when they were told that it was a meaningful evaluation of their abilities. But when they were told that the same test was meaningless and being taken just for fun, they were more likely to prepare diligently. So let's think about that. When the test counted, procrastinators procrastinated. But when it didn't, they diligently prepared. The more that was at stake, the more procrastinators felt the need to protect themselves by not trying too hard. That's some of the twisted logic behind procrastination. Now, there are neuroscientific explanations for procrastination as well. Some researchers think of procrastination as a kind of battle between two different parts of our brain, a battle that's being played out within our brains. On the one hand, between the limbic system and the younger part of our brain called the prefrontal cortex. The limbic system is sometimes called the paleomammalian brain. It's responsible for emotion and pleasure seeking. It's the part of the brain that's usually associated with impulsive behavior and instant gratification. On the other hand, there's the prefrontal cortex, which evolved more recently, like 15 million years ago, a relative blink of the eye in evolutionary time. And it governs the more complex stuff, like what is often called executive function, reasoning, problem solving, planning for the future. Now, it's possible to think about procrastination as a case where we fail to manage our emotions, the anxiety, the stress that we might encounter in any day. And when that happens, we allow our limbic system to win the battle inside our brains, so that a procrastinator may put off, let's take it as an example, may put off working on her taxes that need to get done. And that's what the prefrontal cortex would suggest she do, get those taxes done. Instead, she spends her time putting off doing the taxes and binging on Netflix instead, which is very pleasing to her limbic brain. But if you reduce it to the absurd, all these different ideas behind procrastination, if you reduce these ideas to the absurd, which is, I guess, kind of what I do for a living, you can see that we're always, in some sense, procrastinating because we're always putting something off. After all, we can't do everything we want to do. We can't do everything at once. It's a matter of making the right choices, putting off the right things at the right time, getting our priorities straight. Back to Darwin. Darwin eventually came to worry that he was spending a little too much time on the barnacles and on the worms. And he did eventually get around to his big project, to the book in which he would explain to the world his ideas about natural selection. And this is why we today have On the Origin of Species, the book he finally wrote that explained those ideas that he first set down nearly 20 years earlier in his private notebooks in 1838. So in Darwin's honor, I want to offer tonight a three-point plan for dealing with procrastination. And point one is to listen to your procrastination. Listen to your procrastination because it might be trying to tell you something. Most of us are part-time procrastinators. That is, we only put off working on some things, on certain kinds of things. Maybe we're diligent about paying our bills on time, but we're really bad about seeing doctors regularly. So one thing we can do is look at the things on our to-do list that we're not doing. What do they all share in common, those tasks that we're avoiding? Why are we avoiding them? Are we postponing them out of some kind of fear of failure? Do we avoid them because they take us out of our comfort zone, because they make us anxious? Or is it that we're unsure if those things should even be on our to-do list in the first place? We're unsure if they're even worth doing. Whatever the case, it's important that we do that self-examination and try to understand what's making us put off these tasks that we habitually put off. Okay, point number 2, find your strategy. So there are plenty of small steps that anyone can take to guard against procrastination. Some of them are great ideas. You could turn off your notifications on your devices to reduce distraction. The novelist Jonathan Franzen famously disabled the Ethernet port on his writing laptop so that he wouldn't be distracted while he was trying to get his writing done. These are versions of what psychologists call commitment devices. A commitment device is a choice that we make now to restrict our choices in the future. And it's not a new idea. For example, in ancient Greek legend, Odysseus asked his sailors to tie him to the mast, right? So that he could not succumb to the tempting call of the sirens. Well, that's a commitment device. If you find a life hack that works for you, a commitment device that works for you, by all means, go for it. But I think that we should not stop there. Those life hacks don't go far enough. When we rely on them, we miss an opportunity for self-knowledge and for self-mastery. So don't just attack the distractions. Also work on the anxieties and the self-doubt that may be at the root of your procrastination. Understand why you're procrastinating and what it's costing you, and you're in a better position to exercise the will needed to defeat it. Finally, point 3, understand that there are many paths to achievement. So when I started working on my book about procrastination, I went on a lot of research trips. And I'd like to say it was just because I wanted my book to be really diligently and thoroughly researched. And I did. But there was something else at work there. And to be honest, that something else was that I was a little nervous about the writing process. It was a daunting task to me. And well, what better way to put off writing than doing more research? So one of the places I went to do that research was to Darwin's house outside London. I went to Down House. I wanted to see his garden. I wanted to see his home. And I wanted to walk on the garden path that he would walk on when he needed to think. I wanted to be on that path where the great man had thought his great thoughts. And it was there that I learned about his fascination with barnacles, his obsession with worms, and there that I learned about his delay, his great delay. And it's true, I found out, that those worms, his work on those worms, cost Darwin a lot of precious time. And even Darwin admitted that late in his life. He said, I wish I had not spent quite so much time on the worms, on the barnacles. But I've also come to think that it's also true that his work hadn't been a complete waste of time. Those obsessions, those side projects hadn't been a complete waste of time. He learned some important things from the worms. He came to believe that worms had a greater impact on the environment, for example, than just about any other creature. And he saw that their biological and environmental impact only revealed itself over these long stretches of time. I think that the worms helped Darwin with his big idea. They helped him understand that natural selection is all about small, incremental change over vast periods that eventually becomes something big and significant. So Darwin, I think, teaches us that even detours can sometimes prove fruitful. And he teaches us that even our wrong turns can be corrected. So listen to your procrastination. Try to understand what it's telling you about yourself, and don't sweat the detours too much. Sometimes, like on Darwin's Garden Path, the road to achievement isn't a straight line. It's a little more roundabout. So thank you for your attention and for your time, and for letting me tell you a little bit about my my experience with Darwin tonight.
Thank you. That was fun. I want to remind people that they are welcome to put any questions or comments that they have into Q&A or into chat. One person, Susan McFall, says, "Don't know who said this, but I have it on my fridge. A procrastinator is the ultimate optimist." And she says, so she's the ultimate optimist.
It's true. Procrastinators believe in tomorrow, don't we?
If you don't put it off, you don't know if it'll just manage itself or not. So I had a question.
Yeah.
What do you think of to-do lists? Are they a good remedy for procrastinators?
For me, not so much. I mean, so I love to-do lists. I make them, and I make a lot of them. If you went in my office, you'd see they're like all over the place, and very few of the things on my to-do list are scratched off. And a lot of times, I make to-do lists kind of in place. It's a replacement activity for the actual things that I put on the to-do list. So if I keep making to-do lists, I don't have to ever get around to doing the work on them. I'm not a big believer in to-do lists, although I do believe in breaking down tasks into little small chunks, the smallest possible bits. And that's one way that I've managed to sort of sneak my way into a task that I dread. Sort of ease my way into it, like you know, putting your foot in a very cold swimming pool, just a little bit at a time.
Thank you. I have a question from Michelle, who says, how with all his work on barnacles that was underappreciated, how did Darwin support himself and his family? Do you happen to know?
That's a really good question. Darwin was from a wealthy family. His father was a renowned person in England himself, and he was from a wealthy family. His wife was from a wealthy family. I think to a certain extent he was self-supporting. He published prolifically, you know, dozens of books. I encountered one of them. I was searching around recently for the title to the book. So he wrote one of the many books he wrote in addition to on the nature of species, was a book about his research on worms. And it was called, I want to make sure I'm getting this right. It was called The Creation of Vegetable Molds and the Impact of Worms Thereon, or something like that. I'm not getting it exactly right, but it's a really sexy title. And that book is still in print today, and I know that because I found it on Walmart.com, you know, really of all unlikely places. So anyway, but that's an example of the many books he published, and he also published accounts and journals of his voyage on the Beagle, on the HMS Beagle, which were a tremendous hit in England. The vegetable mold worm book, it was a bestseller. Honest to God, it was. So he did. I think his writing provided quite a lot of income as well.
Right, thank you. Melissa says, "I have never looked at procrastination in the way you described. Thank you. I can forgive myself for thinking I could easy."
I think that's an important thing. I mean, I don't want to excuse procrastination, and it can be a really dangerous habit. And I make light of it a lot and try to have fun with it. But God knows there's people who suffer from it greatly, and people for whom it's tied to, you know, really serious issues of depression and anxiety. So I don't want to make too much light of it. but I also think that our society is really, I think there's a lot of needless guilt about procrastination and a lot of needless emphasis on productivity. It's really unhealthy. And so in my small way, I kind of wanted to chip away at that guilt.
How does work from home, the current concept of how does that work with procrastinators?
So for me, it's always been a challenge for me to work from home, and it's, I think, a lot easier to procrastinate at home. There's no one typically looking over my shoulder at home. There's more distractions. There's a refrigerator. So for me, it's always been hard. And I've been, as I mentioned, been doing this for a long time, long before the pandemic. And what I've heard from my friends and heard anecdotally and read in accounts in magazines and journals is that for the people who have just recently started working from home, it's been a real challenge, obviously. I mean, they're marooned at home with kids who are trying to get their work done at school, and their spouses are at home too, also working. I know my wife and I have learned to put up with each other's work conversations. I learned more about my wife's work than I ever wanted to, because she's right in the other room talking about it. And anyway, those are all hurdles to be overcome and all obstacles to getting our work done. To say nothing of the stress and the anxiety that's come along with this really difficult time. So no, I mean, I'm sure there's some people for whom work from home is a really great, productive way to live. Good for them. I'm not one of them.
You're here. Stephanie Brown Kirch, I think who you knew from a previous job at Edelman, she says she's not surprised you're an author, and she has a question of the strategies to remedy procrastination. Which do you think is the most effective most often?
That's a really great question. So I believe in some of the life hacks that I talked about in the in the talk. I believe in trying to reduce distractions as much as possible. And I also believe in creating rewards for myself. So there's something called the Pomodoro method. It's called Pomodoro because it's named for a kind of kitchen timer. It looks like a tomato. And anyway, so the idea is to set a timer and work for a certain amount of time, and then reward yourself for having stuck with it and worked for that amount of time. For an example, I might set the timer for 45 minutes and try to get 45 minutes worth of real serious writing done with no distractions, no timeouts to get on Twitter, no nonsense. And if I do that, I give myself the reward of 15 minutes of Twitter or 15 minutes of eating everything I could get my hands on in the refrigerator, whatever it is. I don't, I don't know if, I should say, I think that would work. I'm not entirely sure because I don't very often get the rewards. So I don't often complete the 45 minutes, but it sounds like a really good idea.
We're going to try the timer method. Thank you. Let's see. Someone else, Cindy asks, what's another example of a great procrastinator?
Yeah, so in the book I talked about Da Vinci, who completed very few paintings in his lifetime, partly because he was, like Darwin, had so many intellectual interests, was always going off on tangents and abandoning one project to work on another project. I should say that a lot of the people, I used the term procrastinator in my book and sometimes in my talks very broadly. I'm not sure Darwin actually qualifies as a procrastinator. He might. And I'm not sure Da Vinci qualifies either, but they do qualify as sort of distracted people who had a lot of different interests and had difficulty finishing things and sometimes difficulty starting things. What I love about those stories is that they, well, first of all, that, they humanize great people and make them more understandable and relatable for us, which is really wonderful. I mean, I got to know Darwin in depth that I had never known him before when I was working on this book. And he's like a really interesting guy, and his family life and his relationship with his wife and his relationship with his kids, just fascinating stuff. And I love getting to know that. There's also the element of procrastinators liking to find out stories like Darwin's or Da Vinci's, because it gives them some kind of cover for their bad habits. That's why, online you can encounter these 10 great procrastinators and from history. You see that kind of clickbait online a lot, and people love it. They eat it up because they can say, oh, see, it worked for Darwin, it worked for Da Vinci. And, maybe it'll work for me. It gives them some cover. I guess that's a relatively harmless delusion. And as long as you don't overdo it, I don't have a problem with that.
I think I remember the story from your book was that Da Vinci had a particular commission that he had a few months to do, and he delivered it 27 years later.
Yeah, he said, I'll have it for you in 6 months. And he finished it like 24 years later. And as a freelance writer, I have some friends that work on those kinds of schedules too. Yeah.
There's another comment from Peggy who says, I attribute some of my procrastination to performance anxiety, like delay writing a paper, for example. Yeah. Sometimes it's rebellion because I don't want to be somewhere. At least I'm aware, and I'd love to overcome this behavior.
Yeah, those are all elements that I talked about with some of the experts. So I'm an author and a journalist and a procrastinator. That's my claim to authority on the topic. I'm not a social scientist, but I did, as I mentioned, I did talk to tons of them, anyone who would talk to me, basically. And yeah, those are things that they mentioned, the idea of rebelliousness. I think one element of procrastination is just not wanting to give in to authority. That could be one explanation. Much more common and much more an issue with me is that she mentions performance anxiety. And I think that, the things I tend to put off are things that I'm anxious about. I'm not the most outgoing person in the world, which is, a questionable trait for a journalist. So when I have to call up a source out of the blue and try to pin them down, it's sometimes a daunting task for me. And that's the kind of thing I put off sometimes. And that's the kind of thing I have to struggle with. And that's exactly what I'm talking about in the talk. I have to identify the anxiety and try to reason through it and get to the root of it so that I can get my work done. I think that, the connection between anxiety and procrastination is like really strong and obvious. And yeah.
And nothing provokes anxiety like a blank page.
Tell me about it. Right. No, that's true. And I think one of the best pieces of advice that I've ever gotten, and one that I occasionally, practice, is to just write something, anything. I think it's Anne Lamott talks about the crappy first draft. And I think that's a wonderful idea. It doesn't have to be good. But get it down, get it on paper, write, and then you can fix it. Then you've started, and then you've put your foot in the swimming pool, and you can ease into the project now, and you can make what the lousy thing that you set down on paper less lousy gradually until it's maybe something good.
And finally, can you tell us just a little bit about Saint Expedite?
Oh yeah, excellent, good. I'm glad to get that question, because that was one of my that was one of the things I loved learning about the most. And I have to watch the clock because I could talk about Saint Expedite till about midnight, but I won't. Saint Expedite, I'll start by saying never existed. Totally apocryphal figure, like some of the early saints were, but he was supposed to have lived, I think it was in 4th century Armenia, and he was a soldier, an Armenian soldier in the Roman legions. And let's see, well, the story is that Expedite decided that he was going to convert to Christianity. He was going to give up his pagan ways and become a Christian. But he was stopped by a talking crow that visited him, and we've all been there. And the talking crow said to him, the crow said, "Expedite, don't do it. What's the rush? Think about it for a day. You could always convert later, but just put it off." But Expedite was determined to convert then, and he crushed the crow underfoot. And so to this day, in representations of the saint, he's shown in his Roman toga tepping on a crow, and he's holding up a banner, the saint is, that says hodie, which is the Latin for today. And the crow's got a banner in his beak that says something about it can wait till tomorrow. And the idea, the moral of the story is supposed to be that we need to tend to our business now. In religious terms, it means you gotta get right with God before it's too late. You don't want to. This is one thing you don't want to delay. And in more secular terms, Expedite has become sort of the patron saint of procrastinators. And in some places, in Rio, in parts of Brazil, and where else? Oh, I'm drawing a blank on the name of the island in the. But there are places where the cult of Saint Expedite is extremely strong, and where people put up roadside shrines to the saint when they want to, when they need his intercession in some problem that they're facing. So that's the story of Saint Expedite. One place in the United States where the cult of Expedite is still pretty strong is in New Orleans, and I went down to New Orleans to go investigate. And leave my own offering to Saint Expedite, which I did. Well, I went down once and didn't get around to doing it. I did everything that you might want to do in New Orleans except go visit Saint Expedite. And then I got home, I realized I didn't do what I'd meant to do, which is like typical, right? And I had to go back to New Orleans a second time. This time I finally got to visit Saint Expedite and talk to some of the people who take care of the shrine to Saint Expedite there. And it's a really interesting story and a cool thing to do, a cool part of New Orleans lore that you don't hear about on the the tourist beat, on the tourist path. So that's the story of Saint Expedite. Hope I didn't go on too long.
No, but I have to ask, what kind of offerings do people make to Saint Expedite?
So I think, if I'm remembering this right, I think the thing to do, at least in New Orleans, is to leave a slice of pound cake and if the pound cake, you leave it there, you write down you write down what you need and your prayer to Saint Expedite and what you're asking him to intercede with, and you leave the pound cake and the prayer there. And if when you come back, the pound cake has disappeared, that means Saint Expedite has heard your prayer and will take care of you. I learned, one of the things I learned on that second trip to New Orleans is that there's a caretaker. Well, the parish priest at the church where the shrine is the guy who tends to the shrine, and he cleans up the pound cake. So I guess I suppose if Father picks up the pound cake and cleans up the shrine, then everything's going to be okay for you. That's how it's supposed to work. It's not. These aren't my rules. I'm just just passing them along.
Well, I never thought this subject would lead us to pound cake and crows, but thank you very much. This has been a lot of fun. I urge you all to take a look at Soon. It's a lot of fun, and if you want to find it at your local library, I think you will have success. No pound cake required. Thank you so much, Andrew Santella, for joining us, and
thank you for having me. I enjoyed it. Thank you all.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.